In today's episode, we're going to be talking with Dr. Spencer Leinweber, who is Professor of Architecture in the School of Architecture at the University of Hawaii. Dr. Leinweber is an architect who works a lot in historic preservation and conservation of important buildings, and she's also worked a lot with students who are training to do their actual practical work in communities and on projects that are intended to assist communities with their architecture. The way in which we met is kind of related to what our topic is today, I think. Right. Maybe you could discuss for the students a little bit about kind of what that project was about.
So Dr. McClatchey and I met because we had a common graduate student, a student who was a graduate student in botany that under the Native Hawaiian Leadership Project was working with me in the architecture school about Native Hawaiian healing. And she was a funded graduate student, and she helped and assisted me in my studio classes to concentrate on the botanical aspects of Native Hawaiian healing, which I had absolutely no knowledge about, and so she was really helpful in that process. And we did, I think she was my student for 2 years, 2.5 years maybe. And we did, in architecture school you have an all-afternoon class and you design things hypothetically, but as much reality as possible needs to get put into that project so that you can really solve the problem in a real way. And so the students had a site on the Big Island at Lapakahi, and they incorporated different aspects of Native Hawaiian healing into that class. It was a great class.
And so within this class you also were working with Papa Henry L.Y.
Right.
And kind of his group of students.
Right. So that site was specific to Papa Oai's family, and he wanted a new building to be built on that site that could be a center for the understanding of Native Hawaiian healing. And that's what my students designed, and each semester was slightly different to his requirements.
So what were some of the considerations and concerns that Papa had that went into that design?
He was very concerned about the site and where a building could go on the site, because there are very definite sacred places on that site that needed to be protected. Also acknowledging the ocean, where the ocean was in relationship to the building and how the building faced. It was basically oriented to the ocean rather than to the road, which is how many buildings are oriented today. Also sunlight, how the sun and how the building wouldn't stop the wind from going up and down the mountain day and night. He worked really closely with the students, and the students that had that interface were really touched by him.
Were there any aspects of the way the structures were designed themselves, other than their orientation, that brought to bear Hawaiian beliefs or perspectives?
I think in some aspects of siting with relationship to the existing rocks on the site. So this is a site that was an agricultural settlement and a fishing village for a long time also, and so there's lots of man-made structures on the site that are still there, as well as outcroppings, and respecting those outcroppings and letting the outcroppings be the strength of how the building was sited, rather than plopping on top of it as an object, but becoming one with the landscape was really important, rather than on top of the landscape.
Well, let me shift here a bit. So we're at Iolani Palace, which is of course a major historical building, probably one of the most important in Hawaii. What are architects doing in Hawaii to address the needs of these kinds of structures and the people who use them?
Well, Iolani Palace today is a museum, and there are many historic sites that are museums today in Hawaii, but not all are museums. So Bishop Museum and Iolani Palace and the missionary buildings are all operated as museums, but most of the historic buildings are in either the same use, continued use, or a use that's been adapted. And the way you look at that is how can the building be respected, the integrity of the building in the new use, and then it gets repaired or restored, or sometimes new additions have to be put on to extend the use of the building.
So I guess one concern that I've heard is that you know, in the past people use different kinds of materials for construction, and a lot of people want to be true to traditional designs. How are modern architects dealing with issues like that, where, you know, say people use peely thatch in the past, and now how do you thatch a house with peely and meet the fire code?
Right. Well, it depends on the building and the kind of materials you're using. I think there's been a shift probably in the last 5 years or less to going back to the original materials and really understanding how those original materials were used. I'll give you a good example. At Mission Houses, that building was coated with cement plaster in the 1960s or early 1960s, and that was part of the damage to the building because the water couldn't get out. It's a coral building, and the water couldn't get out. It had cement plaster on the inside, outside, and gypsum plaster, which is hygroscopic, on the inside. And it was horrible material, but it was the sort of current high technology material for that time period. It's just recently been restored, putting back the original lime plaster, which is hard to make, and you need to really understand the sort of chemistry of lime plaster to make it work. But now the building breathes just like it was meant to do when it was originally designed, and I think there's, at least recently, a lot more focus about understanding the historic materials and how they operated, rather than trying to find a substitute material in the modern technology.
That makes a lot of sense. So, are there other kinds of buildings around? So you mentioned these ones. Are there homes that people are living in that are I mean, so there's still that traditional use?
Yes, and they're actually, Hawaii has a very good tax abatement program for residential structures, that if you're listed on the Hawaii register, that you do not pay any property tax. So you pay $100, that's all, every year.
Wow.
My house is listed on the Hawaii register.
Wow.
And they're probably...
You're a tax dodger.
No, I am preserving an important part of Hawaii's historic places. So there are a lot of houses that are written now on the Hawaii register because of that tax abatement program.
So in order to do that, there must be a trade-off. So you're expected to do certain
You are
things.
supposed to keep the amount of money. In my house, I would probably pay $5,000 in taxes a year, because it's on a big piece of land, not that it's such a great house. You're supposed to spend that much every year on maintaining your home.
I see.
So that's the trade-off.
That's the trade-off.
I'm not really tax dodger.
When you're working in a house like that, can you just use any old materials, or do you need to use the kinds that were there originally?
Well, you need to understand what the materials are that are there and why they were used. And in the example of the lime plaster, the plaster is there to allow the coral to be protected but still breathe. And so if you're using another material, you have to understand what the original material was doing first in its original location. In my house, I just use the original materials again because they're readily available. It's primarily wood and lava rock.
I've seen that kind of in the Hawaiian Renaissance, a lot of people now are wanting to build Hawaiian houses not only out of traditional materials, but some people actually even want to live in them and use them as functional buildings. You know, it's kind of this really neat thing. But they are also facing the issue of, you know, how do I get a permit to build a haliva'a and, you know, use it, you know, and have fun in it, and be able to do it legally.
Right, because there's a very all-encompassing building code in Hawaii, both a land use ordinance code to limit zoning and things like that, and as well as a construction code, which is Uniform Building Code. Maui has done a lot recently in promoting the use of traditional construction, so that it's a special amendment to the Maui Code, that as long as you bind with certain kind of materials and put the posts into the ground for a certain distance, you can construct a traditional hale.
As I understand, you're not allowed to use concrete, is that right?
Right. Maui is the only one that has gone that far, because they want to use them for traditional uses more than anything. New house or residence. The focus here has been primarily for tourist business, and that has a completely different code requirement in terms of life safety, and the perspective is always life safety. How do you protect the structure and the people in the structure?
I guess there's a flip side to this, which is that a lot of people here in Hawaii and elsewhere in the world have a strong desire to bring kind of traditional forms and meanings forward and use them in modern design. What's your perspective on that?
Well, architecture is always relating to the culture that it's serving, and through different time periods of Hawaii's history, that desire for what architecture was expressing changes. The Aulani Palace is a good example of that. Today it is certainly close to the heart of all Hawaiians about the sort of memory of the monarchy is represented here in a building. But when Kalakaua built it, he was trying to be a king who had a place in the world, and he built a building that had a place in the world. This is a building that basically has a French derivation in terms of its construction, and it's used on major public buildings in Paris and in New Orleans and other places for this 1880s time period. And he was saying, I am a king of the world when he built this building.
That's very interesting.
The building across the street that was done by Julia Morgan for the YWCA is also another cultural statement where it's basically an Italian palace. And it has a beautiful courtyard inside, a swimming pool, air that moves through the building, very short depth of the building so that it can be naturally ventilated. And that was a statement for Hawaii when she built that in 1927, that it was part of how Hawaii was a tropical environment, but a westernized environment, and that's a good product of that decision-making process.
How do you see design going in Hawaii now? I mean, it's certainly multicultural.
I think it's multicultural only to some extent. If you look at all those office buildings behind the camera, those are certainly not at all respective of Hawaii's environment. They're all air-conditioned, they're sucking energy like mad out of our environment, and they're not an appropriate, I don't think, an appropriate solution to our environment. And that's because the cultural desire is one of economy, capitalism, and it's making an efficient building to serve a certain need that produces a certain income stream. And that also is a cultural aspect of our environment, and it changes through time.
That certainly is an interesting aspect, where some cultures, through their architecture, they're clearly trying to fit into the environment and work with it, and others are trying to fight against the environment.
Right. And it's all what are the rules that people are playing by? What are their sort of cultural rules? Right now, we definitely have cultural rules that relate to capitalism in terms of the product that's being produced in architecture. I think in some of the new students that are coming up through the system, they're much more educated in terms of sustainability, not taking more from the environment than what you put back. And that's really a relatively new point of view. And we haven't seen that resulting in really great buildings yet. That's interesting.
I'm curious to see how that is likely to play out. For instance, one problem I can see is that most of these bigger buildings, the materials in them come from a long ways away.
Right.
So a lot of fuel, processing, and other things. Right. And the people who are using the building don't necessarily feel the impact of the extraction of the resources that made it.
Right.
Whereas in traditional societies, of course, you're next to the building materials. You live with them, and if you don't take care of them, no more new buildings.
Yeah. I think there is another shift that's going on just in that piece of building materials that you're right, that people don't really relate that the stone on the floor of the hallway they're walking through came from Italy and at a great expense to get it here. There is now looking at building materials and how they can be recycled, and that stone on the floor, when it ends up in the dump truck actually becomes aggregate for concrete or something else. And that's the last piece of the sustainability piece, that we are going to run out of materials, and we are going to run out of all that those natural materials that we're using, and we have to look at architecture in a new way, how we can recycle, not just recycle the buildings, but recycle the materials of the buildings if the building is no longer usable.
Now, of course, a lot of this has to do with the need for new buildings, because either the old buildings die or they fall apart, or because we have a growing population base. So many of the models show that although human populations are continuing to climb right now, that these should be leveling off soon and actually starting to decrease. Hopefully that will be the case. Hopefully we'll be responsible in that way. So if that is the case, and we actually reach a point where we're in a population decline, and we've seen this in other parts of the world. Europe has this in many places. What happens to the cultural perspective of construction building?
I'm not sure. I think one of the changes that I'm at least seeing in the changing sort of family base, where it used to be that children would leave and then come back, and that was the home was structured to allow that to happen. And then there was a period where the children left and never came back, and now there's a period where the children are also coming back again, but wanting some self-identity in that living environment. And I think the living environment will change in the next 20 years, where much less space will be needed by individuals, because there are many more people that are not in their home that much. They're in another environment, a work environment or a play environment, and the home needs to provide things, but not maybe a television room and a dining room and 26 different rooms, which you would find in the larger homes from the turn of the century today. I think there are two strands that are going. This sort of McDonald's super burger house is still getting constructed, not lived in, but still being constructed. And then the people who are really interested in an environment that's appropriate to their lifestyle are building much smaller houses.
So you see our culture generally shifting.
I see the culture shifting. And architecture is at times right in the lead of that shift and able to recognize that shift before everybody else realizes what it is. And I think the residential environment is doing that. There's still those big houses being built, but there's a definite shift to a smaller house, a much more intimate house, more people-friendly house, where you're using a space in more than one way.
That's interesting. So I'm curious if this is a somewhat of a universal phenomenon, or if it's culture-specific change, you think?
I'm not familiar with everybody, of course, but it's definitely a Western phenomenon right now. And I think also in Japan, which is what I'm most familiar with, there is they're in the one that we've just been through, where the family unit wants to be out, the children want to be out of the family unit and have their complete separate identity. And we're ahead of that in terms of children going back.
So as we, if we were to take a tour around Oahu, we'd find that there's kind of little patches of communities where you find kinds of architecture. I picture driving into Kalihi and I see all of these houses like I'd see in the Philippines. So that architectural style has been brought here, and it's kind of a signature. And
well, if you really look carefully, the construction is a local construction. The plantation construction style, which is wood exterior, wood frame building, is still being built today. It's just the accoutrements that go on the building are reflective of the culture. So the plantation style, which many of the buildings in Kalihi and Kaimuki and other Waipahu are part of that basic understanding of box structure, frame structure. Then additional elements go on to reflect the culture. Those may be decorative elements. In the case of a building that's a Japanese building, may get some turn up of the eaves or reflection of the eaves that is much more Asian. Or in the case of a Buddhist temple, it gets construction just in the temple and the roof shape, and how the roof is articulated and the gable ends are articulated. In Portuguese structures or buildings, sometimes there are outbuildings that are reflective of the culture. So you might find a bread oven or something in a backyard. We did all the research for Plantation Village in Waipahu, and we interviewed we did probably 100 oral histories as part of that project. And there were 8 different ethnic groups that were sort of responsible for that project, and each of them had very specific things that they wanted as part of that village to express their culture.
so what were some of those kinds of elements? I mean, you've just said some of them.
We built a forno in the back of the Portuguese house. We had identified all of these buildings, mostly outbuildings, in our oral histories, but we didn't find a lot of them still existing. We did about 2,000 hours of research on that project, so it was really intensive. And part of that sort of research resulted in us with a list of what we were looking for, and so we basically drove around looking for stuff. And we had a lot of good newspaper articles in the paper, and people would call us up and go, "Oh, you're looking for a family furrow. I have that in my backyard." And so we went out and measured and either reconstructed it. In some cases, the whole building was moved to the park. So it was a wonderful project because we met lots of really great people.
So I know that a fair amount of your work has been where people have come to you and they need some help with the project. What's your feelings about the need for architects in the community to be responsive to the community like that?
It's a critical piece of architecture today, and in our program we require a community project in their 6th year. They have to spend at least 8 hours a week in a community project, which is a pretty intensive donation of your time, and that's to get you in the mindset that you are actually working for the community rather than placing these objects in the landscape that bear no relationship to the community.
So a lot of times the students who are participating and watching these episodes are kind of trying to find their way, trying to figure out what their future is going to be. And some of them probably do have a bent towards something like architecture, but they've grown intrigued by some of the things we talk about in ethnobotany. Is there a way to put these together?
So you're trying to sell them an ethnobotany when they really want to be architects.
Yeah, that's right. So how are you going to hook them away from us?
All right. Well, we do have, we are beginning to start a program in landscape architecture, which will be an interdisciplinary degree, and so it would include ethnobotany as some of the classwork that's required. Would have design studios, so they would be able to do the sort of spatial manipulation. But if you're not ready to sort of jump into architecture 100%, there are also classes at the 400 level that are a combination of students from other programs into our program. We've had a couple of, we mostly get planning students and a lot of American Studies students and some chemistry students I've had too, because they're interested in the technology part of architecture. And I guess my recommendation would be don't believe any of those prerequisites that are in the catalog. Go talk to the professor. Because you can always get into a class if you can show your interest and what you are really, why you're wanting to take the class.
So what can you tell us about the landscaping here at the Iolani Palace?
Well, the landscaping that's here is primarily government landscaping right now, and there's been a huge fight for at least the last 20 years about taking out this macadam or blacktop asphalt in front of the palace building. When the palace was initially designed, it had a very high fence around it, and that was then reduced to this lower level. In the front, there were parterre gardens, or sort of geometric gardens at very low scale, flower beds. It's unknown what kind of plant material were in those gardens because they're just photographs from above, and so you can see the pattern, but you don't know exactly what the, maybe you could recognize it with a microscope or magnifying glass. Yeah. There certainly are native trees here, but then there are also lots of introduced trees. So I don't think there's been a good focused thought on making this much more representative of what was here before, and where the materials that are Kalakaua materials should be reintroduced, or at least so that that could be interpreted to what the landscape was like at that time.
Are there writings from the era that kind of imply what he had in mind? Or?
There are writings about the parterre gardens, about wanting to be able to look from the upper balcony down on the gardens, and I know there's at least 2 photographs of that. The records of purchase for all the materials are recorded for Iolani Palace, but not the purchase of any plant materials.
So one of the interesting aspects about traditional construction is that the ancient contractors use their own bodies as the measuring sticks. How does that relate to modern construction?
It relates in the localized scale of things. Heights of counters are obviously part of the comfortable height to do certain kind of work. Counter heights for kitchens, different than counter heights for writing your term papers. But a lot of construction today is on the technology of building materials from a production point of view rather than a measuring, hand to elbow point of view, which would be more typical in the Hawaiian house or, hand spread. Today it's all manufacturing, so everything is done in multiples of 4x8 sheets of plywood or 2-foot lengths for pieces of steel, or certain lengths of run of clapboard siding or something like that. So it's done by manufacturing rather than for the technology of how to construct it.
So it's driven by the manufacturers?
It's driven by the manufacturers, absolutely.
Wow. Okay. Is there any kind of a rebellion against that, or is there anything you can do about that?
If you are using a material that's much more adaptable, like wood, where you are actually cutting the lengths yourself, then you're doing it much more to the body scale and what you actually need for the body scale. And these houses that have the sort of multiple use of them, living room being the family room and the dining room and everything all in one space, I think those are much more scaled to the needs rather than manufacturer driven.
I noticed that in a lot of older buildings, the ceilings are 9, 10, 11. They're not always the same height, whereas in modern ones, oftentimes they're 8 feet.
Right. So those ceilings are 8 feet or 9 feet, which are gypboard heights.
Right.
But also the older ceilings were higher because the ventilation was needed to run through the building, and the height was needed to allow the air to have enough space to be able to move through the building. Today, you flick on the air conditioner and you're cold.
Well, do you have any last comments for the students before we conclude this?
Yeah, I think I do. I think the most important thing about architecture is that everyone has their own cultural bias of looking at architecture, and that you need to understand that. That bias can be from your own family history. It can be from research that you've done and knowledge that you've gained, but you still have your own eyeglasses of how you look at space, and the more you are aware of that and understand that and can sort of dissect it, the more you can understand what are the contributing factors to why you understand space or how you understand space.
So one of the themes that we have running through these episodes is that plants are all around us. Certainly you see this in architecture as well, and I really appreciate your insights.
Great, it was great to be here.
Thank you. And I look forward to seeing this developing landscape architecture program.
Yeah, we'd really like to get that going.
Hopefully we'll have some of our students participate. I look forward to participating.
Great.
It'll be fun. Thank you.
Thank you.